really the parks have done remarkably well. As I travel around the state, I'm just told story after story of how aggressive our folks were at getting out when waters came up and started to recede, at removing debris and opening up campsites and cabins as soon as possible to where we could safely do that. And the result of that has been that it's been really remarkable at how little impact there's been on our revenues since that big hit in June. So I'm so proud of the work that all the folks in the Parks Division have done to do their very best in a really tough situation. Revenue for October was similar to 19, and so overall our cash balance there in the Park Fee Fund is down about $1.5 million, mainly due to those early summer impacts. Cabin revenue was down last year about 16% from the previous year, but that's weather related, as you can imagine. The Wildlife Fee Fund is up overall about 1.3%. Compared to last year. Our balance at the end of million, which is just a little higher than it was October of last year. So that's good news for the Wildlife Fee Fund. The last thing I'll mention is kind of the status of our federal funds. Steve Adams, who oversees that program, indicated that Pittman Robertson funds are expected to be down about 15% next year as a result of lower sales. That comes from ammunition and guns and those kind of things largely. Dingell Johnson is expected to be up about 3%, so we don't expect any change to these forecasts till after the first of next year. So with that, I'd stand for any questions, Mr. Chair.
Any questions for Brad? I think our people really got out as soon as they could. It's just that we still have some damage that we don't know in places in northeast Kansas. Two of our most frequently visited reservoirs still aren't able to have public access, particularly on the boat ramps. We don't know where we're at on some of that.
Right.
But hats off to our staff. Any other questions for anybody? From anybody?
What's the water levels look like? What are you hearing from the Bureau? And
Yeah.
is there anything coming down the pike as far as future draw?
Yeah, so Linda, you want to update them on that? The challenge, of course, is what's going on downstream, and we continue to struggle with that.
The Secretary is exactly right. Thank you, Mr. and members. We're still Creek, Milford, and it just goes down the line to years that we're going to be high for a while. They're still letting is down. I think the Corps of Engineers is managing it best they can. High in some of those reservoirs. So Cheney Reservoir the area is still saturated. Commissioner Sill, you know that. It's wet around there. And people are still pumping, they're using their sunk pumps in their houses. They're trying to figure out a solution for that. And I think that's what the purpose. Engineers and the Bureau there. Secretary said you didn't notice it in August and September because our visitation is down overall, but gosh, some of these areas that need to be fixed. So any other questions?
The Corps has used Waverly, Missouri as their biggest concern.
It is.
And is that a confluence of two rivers, or close to the flood?
It starts the north part of the United States and comes down, and so we just happen to flow into. And my simple mind is like, let's buy out Waverly, Missouri, but I'm sure there's another town that will come. So
yeah, we always worry about us and not who's downstream.
well, I get it, because it's devastating. It was devastating. And you have to remember, this is the worst flood ever in Kansas, so it was the most widespread.
Any other questions? Brad?
Yeah. We have had conversations directly with the colonel over the Kansas City district asking about this. And one of the questions I asked him, because I was naive about this also, I said, we hear everything comes around to the level of wind. And for all summer long, we heard, they can't go above a certain level. I don't know what that was, some elevation. Well, then in the fall, they all of a sudden shifted that, and they allowed themselves to go up higher and release more water to do that. And so I asked, so did that mean that fields in Waverly, Missouri were flooding? And they said no. But what it did was it removed their margin, right? So it moved the level up higher, so there was a greater risk of flooding in that area. And it's just a benchmark. It's just a place they pick. But interestingly, if anybody questions the Corps' desire to get rid of that water faster, you don't need to, because they are scared to death right now about being ready for next spring's rainwaters. And the only thing worse than a flood like we had is 2 in a row. And so they are working as aggressively as they can to get rid of all this water in these reservoirs and prepare for next spring.
And I will say, Missouri flooded very bad too. So their state park systems were impacted. Arkansas flooded. So it's not just Kansas. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Chris?
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, we're going to start in January, the second year of a 2-year cycle. We had about 6 bills that we had on our website last year. We anticipate that we will work on 3 plus another this year. The first one was Senate Bill 49, cabin pricing, and it was dynamic pricing for cabins and campsites. That did pass the Senate, passed out of the House committee, and then when it got onto the House floor, was routed to appropriations. So they kind of bottled it up in House appropriations, and we need to figure out our strategy going forward on that. Senate Bill 50 dealt with fee caps. As you know, many of our fees are capped in statute. You set those fees by regulation. That bill is sitting in where it was introduced in Senate Natural Resources. House Bill 2099, which Secretary referenced, KPF, Kansas Police and Fire, moving our law enforcement officers in those 3 divisions into that retirement program. Had a hearing, passed out of committee, and then did not make it above the line, which meant it was killed. So we'll have to reintroduce that. There was an interim committee hearing last week, and I'll turn that over to Brad to talk about.
Yeah, so a couple things. We sought advice on, this seems like something everybody would agree on. So Chris and I had conversation with different people about how we can strategize a little differently and be successful with this year. So one of the inputs we got was have the governor put it in her budget. So that wasn't hard to do. She said, that's fine. That made clear her support of this. And then we got more active, more visible when it came to this. And then I went in front of that committee, what was that? Last Monday, not that long ago. And presented on this. I was optimistic based on the response. There were really no critical questions about it. And importantly, I mean, we went in saying there were other entities that also wanted to get their personnel in this retirement program. But in those cases, they were both asking for money, so general fund money to pay for their folks to get into it. And then they also, all the people that they were asking to be included weren't necessarily law enforcement. So those were, to me, pretty big barriers. In our case, it was kind of an easy conversation because all our folks are certified law enforcement with responsibilities across the state. And we were providing the money for them to be in. So it seems like it wouldn't be a hard decision. With the governor's support and a clear message from the agency, which we're providing, we're optimistic.
Okay. We're also looking at a land transaction down in Kingman. I don't know exactly how it's going to shape up, but as soon as we get the details, that'll be our other initiative. There were 3 other bills. Deer transferable bill that got gutted and became something else after it passed the House. House Bill 2397, dangerous regulated animals, which did not get a hearing, which is, you know, as some of your commissioners know, we have regulations related to that, caging requirements and such. And then House Bill 2062 with rail trails. There was talk of an interim. There hasn't been anything done on that. And then the last thing that I had heard that has been brought up already was thermal imaging, and it really related to feral swine in Missouri. Missouri has authorized, or is in the process of authorizing thermal imaging to hunt feral swine on private lands. Hunting feral swine on public lands is prohibited. We're way ahead of that curve in Kansas in relation to feral swine, but that brought forth the point about predators and thermal imaging. So hopefully the action that we're proposing to take and that we've discussed will stave that off. And that's all that I have.
Okay, is there any questions for Chris? You mentioned the dangerous wildlife. Is this part of what was the Captive Wildlife Safety Act that we had to deal with several years ago?
Yes, it goes back to 2005, I think 2006, and when the legislature passed those provisions in a matter of days, it's the fastest bill I've ever seen move. We subsequently had to enact regulations. This would modify that some. It's been a long time since I've looked at that bill because I don't think it's probably going to go anywhere, but it would add primates and wolves is a difficult topic with delineation of DNA and what actually is a true wolf versus a hybrid and lots of
It would
complications.
add primates and wolves to the prohibited or the regulated group.
Yes, it would add primates and wolves.
Any other questions for Chris? Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Recovering America's Wildlife Act update and resolution signing.
Try and keep all this one. Okay, thank you for allowing me to speak today. I'm Darren Riddle. I'm the Wildlife Diversity Coordinator for out of the Pratt office. And just a little background. In 2016, a blue ribbon panel was put together and is actually called the Blue Ribbon Panel on Sustaining America's Diverse Fish and Wildlife Resources. And they were tasked with putting together recommendations to build mechanisms to fund conservation for all fish and wildlife. And their first recommendation was that Congress dedicate up to $1.3 billion annually in existing revenue in the general treasury to the Wildlife Conservation and Restoration Program. On October 20th, 2016, I spoke to the commission, and we had a similar resolution that the commission supported that supported the findings of the Blue Ribbon Panel. Since then, a bill has been developed, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It was introduced into Congress in July of this year, and it was introduced as a bipartisan bill by Representative Debbie Dingell, a Democrat from Michigan, and Jeff Fortenberry, a Republican from Nebraska. Since it has been introduced, it has gained 151 co-sponsors, including Roger Marshall from Kansas. And under this bill, H.R. 3742, it would provide $1.397 billion to be allocated annually between states, tribes, and territories. This allocation would equal roughly $19 million annually for Kansas, and this would go in as a sub-account under the Pittman-Robertson Act. And these funds would be for the implementation of our State Wildlife Action Plan. The State Wildlife Action Plan is a legislatively mandated plan that all state wildlife agencies have to have that promotes proactive conservation to preclude the need to preclude federal listing of species through habitat improvements, research, monitoring, and so forth, a lot of the things that we do now, which is currently funded under the State Wildlife Grants Program. And under State Wildlife Grants Program, our annual appropriation is roughly $700,000. So you can see it's a huge jump in funding. And I mentioned the State Wildlife Action Plan. I did hand out a copy of this about a year or so ago, but I think we have some new faces on the commission. If anybody would like a copy, I do have a few copies here. If you'd like this, a copy of our agency's Wildlife Action Plan. There are some additions under this bill, additional activities that would be supported under Recovering America's Wildlife Act that are not currently supported under state wildlife programs. That is, a minimum of 10% of funds could go to recovery of current species listed as T&E under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Up to 15% of these funds can be spent on wildlife-related education and recreation activities, including nature center programming, trails, community-based engagement, you name it. So there's education component here. And there's also a law enforcement component. Funds can be used to support law enforcement activities that are directly related to our Kansas State Wildlife Action Plan. So as in support of this bill and also working within the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies as part of the campaign for Recovering America's Wildlife Act, states are being asked to revisit and update resolutions supporting Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So I have presented you with a resolution here, and if you approve, Chairman Lauber would sign it, and then we'll hand it off to Secretary Lovelace. So, and then if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them if I could.
Yeah, I do have, first of all, personally, I think it's probably a good idea, and I support it. My question is, can we provide a resolution just without any public hearing? Okay. Does everybody on the commission maybe want to read this, and then before the meeting's over today, we'll handle this by voice vote or does it require a roll call vote?
It's just a consensus, Mr. Chairman.
Just a consensus. Well, does everybody want to take some time, or are we ready to go ahead and just approve a resolution?
I got a couple questions, just clarification, but out of the 1.4 billion, Kansas gets 19 million annually.
Correct.
That's correct. How has that allocation arrived?
It is, if I remember right, it's part population, part land area.
Okay.
It's pretty similar to Pittman-Robertson allocation.
If it's population, it's about double our share. But, okay. Okay.
Are there other questions? Is staff recommending this?
Yes.
Okay. Does anybody here want to think about it or have any objections? I'm referring to the commission.
The resolution just encourages the delegation to support the legislation, right?
And just so you know, the governor also has a letter which we're asking her to sign to send to our delegation, encouraging the same thing.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I'm prepared to sign it,
Yeah.
so.
I'm good.
Sign it.
If there's, anybody else have any thoughts?
I'm okay with it.
All right. Well, then what I will do is Brad and I'll sign it, and I'll give it to Brad, or you to do whatever you want to do with it.
Okay, great.
You need a motion?
I don't think.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I will take one of those books.
Have enough extras?
I may have one, and I hate to have a second one, but I can't.
Eric probably.
Okay, Linda, Little Jerusalem grand opening.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and the commissioners, and nice job, Darren. $19 million. Jeez. So I'm going to, before I bring Greg here to the podium, he's going to give you a short video of our grand opening of Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park. But I want to say to our team sitting out here, our team worked tirelessly to get that thing open, did a great job. We have our West Region, a lot of our West Region folks here, Luke and Wes from Prairie Dog, and Alex here from Meade, and Phil and Sarah Kay and Greg and Steve. You guys are awesome. And Nadia, thank you so much. I believe we had the most impressions of a state park ever, social media wise. And Jason Dixon, thank you for your help on getting the information out on Little Jerusalem. And as you continue to do so, we thank you. And so Greg is going to come up and actually talk about the grand opening. It was awesome. So Greg, please come forward.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a, can we see it from here?
Do you guys want to sit in the front row?
Huh?
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, yeah. And do we need to dim a light? Would it help if I turned a light off? Anybody?
It'd be more romantic.
This one out, it's okay.
There you go.
Okay, Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park. This is basically directions from Oakley and Scott City. So basically, 23 miles south of Oakley or 21 miles north, you'll both go to Gold Road, 2.5 miles west, go north on 400, and you make her to the parking area. What is Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park? It's owned by the Nature Conservancy. It's part of the Smoky Valley Ranch. This agency signed a 20-year agreement to manage as a state park. It's a Niobrara chalk formation, geological formation that was deposited between 82 and 87 million years ago during the late Cretaceous period. Area was part of the Western Interior Seaway. It's very rich in fossils. Pretty much everywhere you step, you're stepping on a fossil. The majority of them are clams, oysters, and squid. It's 330 acres, 2 hiking trails, a 1,200-foot interpretive trail, and a 3,700-foot single-track trail, large parking area with turnaround. We do have a modern restroom, automated cantilever gate, which will open at sunrise, close at sunset, and a Ramada with interpretive signage. On May 2018, Little Jerusalem Badlands becomes a state park. That's a good drone photo. The first thing we did out there is we had the Kansas Travel Guide photo shoot. Took about 3,000 photos, and I think he used one. We basically, the cool thing about this park is not everybody gets to build a state park from the beginning. You know, most of them have been built for 50 plus years, so it's cool that you got to be there on the ground floor. So we had a clean palette. The first thing we did, and I know Steve does not want credit for any of this, but Steve Seibel probably deserves more credit than anybody because he came out, it's just a big pasture, and had me run around with a storyboard while he's shooting elevation. I had no idea what we were doing. He set stakes. Westar Energy Green Team, Secretary Lovelace was with them. They assisted us setting all of these limestone posts. We had to basically cow-proof the parking lot because they can still graze on the property. We started this, I believe, last October. Just photos of us installing. I think the limestone posts were purchased from around Nest City. And I really didn't know if we were ever going to get done. Westar Energy Green Team, we had 2 self-closing pedestrian gates. They were gracious enough to help install them while some of the other members were building the fence. And I apologize for going fast, but I got 83 slides. That is the self-closing pedestrian gate. And that is the longer trail. That is Life on the Rocks Trail. That is the Westar Energy Green Team posing for a photo by the gate they just installed. There was actually, the Nature Conservancy hired a contractor out of Colorado to come build the single track trail. They had awesome equipment, which I wish we had. Their trail is beautiful. At that time, the parking lot construction started, so basically they removed, I don't know how many yards of material, 10,000 yards or something, I don't know. But basically, they were building the parking lot. Some photos of them laying out, still removing dirt. They brought in blue shale and then asphalt on top, asphalt millings. That is them on their final grade. It started to take shape. I do got to give a shout out to KDOT. We weren't really super 100% happy with the way the asphalt looked. I reached out to KDOT. They brought up a pneumatic packer, roller, and a brine truck. So very cool of them to assist. Different view looking back to, I believe that is looking to the east. This is us, our crew, Phil, our seasonals, building the 1,200-foot interpretive trail. We basically rented a rototiller for the front of our skid steer. We rototilled 4 inches, removed the dirt with that dump trailer, and then laid down rock. I'm pretty proud of it because we built it. It's not quite as pretty as the one from the Colorado guys built, but I think it's pretty darn nice. At the end of it is a trail overlook, so you can look at the formations. They began parking lot concrete work, laying all the sidewalks. That was contracted out. They did a wonderful job. That you'll see the handicap parking areas. And during this time, we were invited to go to the Capitol for the Trails Appreciation Day and just got hit up by tons of people about Little Jerusalem. The whole time we're building this park, every day people drove in there. Can we see it? Can we see it? No, you can't. But you know, when we left, they just turned around and went right back in. We had a meeting out there. We wanted to get some of the Logan County Sheriff's Department, Scott County Sheriff's Department, the local EMS, to come out and tour the property in case there's ever an emergency, somebody gets hurt. They would know kind of the layout. They have a really cool drone that actually has a speaker, so they could fly the drone and hover over a person and say, drop that rock. Or are you hurt, I guess. You can see the 1,200-foot trail down there to the overlook. And then on this photo at the top, you can see the ziggly line. That is the Life on the Rocks trail. This is the columns for the Ramada, which was a long process. They built forms, filled them up with concrete, then poured the base around it. And at that time, we jumped to the bathroom. We poured our own footer for the bathroom. We put all the plumbing in. Again, hats off to Steve Seibel. We would have never been able to do it without him. Bathroom gets delivered and is set on with a crane. Septic line going in, and then we basically poured the concrete around it. We had one chance to drill a water well to hook up our bathroom to, and unfortunately, we had water for about 15 seconds, and then it went away. So we did get with the local landowner. We've tapped into his line. Opening day, we kind of ran out of water. It seemed like all of his cows went to get a drink at the same time, and we lost all the water pressure. So unfortunately, we had to close the bathroom down that evening. This is us installing the signs. There's, I believe, 12 interpretive panels along the trail, and they turned out phenomenal. This is us building the directional sign at Golden 400, directing traffic in. Sarah Kay had the privilege of routering that by hand with just pencil marks on it. Did a fabulous job. That is our cantilever gate getting delivered, 1,500 pounds that we are in the process of installing right now. We had to build a block wall wrapped in stone veneer for a sign. So this is the beginning of the block going up. And that is the stone veneer, and there is Sarah Kay. And there is Phil laying stone veneer. First time that any of us have laid stone veneer, and that they did a phenomenal job. Looking back towards the Ramada, we have a tarp up. We're standing underneath it in the rain, still laying stone veneer so we can get done. Because I believe we laid stone veneer up until 2 days before the grand opening. That is the cap for the block wall that we poured in the shop for the sign. That is the sign mounted, and then the cap went on top. This is where Phil laid stone veneer on 4 columns, and it took about 2 weeks probably to do the columns. This is our directional sign at Golden 400 we're installing, and I think we put the sign up about 2 or maybe the day before the grand opening. This is the entrance sign, which looks phenomenal, getting set on a concrete pad. And this is our guest book. We bought 3 big hunks of limestone so people could carve their name in it, get it out of their system. And really, they're really filled up. There's a picture, we had 20 dozen cookies made, screen printed with the logo. We unfortunately had 615 people show up, so we were a little short on cookies. This is a grand opening with Governor Kelly. This is the staff. Patsy is the administrative specialist in the middle. There's Phil and Sarah Kay. Nobody knew what those rocks were, so I went and grabbed a couple and gave him a scratching awl and said, I want you guys to be the first ones to sign our guest book. And he's like, we're the luckiest people ever. 20 minutes later, he comes back and said, my car just got smashed. I'm jinxed. So unfortunately, he had the best times and the worst. The Ramada just got delivered last week. It's phenomenal. It was built in Ellis. I believe it's 5 pieces. They brought it out here and put it back together. It's absolutely amazing. Beautiful. A couple benches. We did probably 25 tours on opening day. And I don't know, Sarah, do you know how many tours we've done total?
You're not right on the number on every day, that sounds about right. And then through October, I've probably done about 20 more tours since opening day.
I expected this to be a popular park. I don't think I expected it to be as popular as it is. There's always traffic up there. Every time you're there, there's 4 or 5 vehicles. The self-pay Iron Ranger, you couldn't have put another dollar in it. It was so packed. It's amazing how much traffic's showing up. That is us with guided tours, and this is just a pretty photo on one of the overlooks. You can sit there. It's your moment of zen. So if anybody's got any questions, I know I went really fast. I didn't want anybody to fall asleep.
Does it take a park permit to get in?
It does.
Is that going to be an issue where people just come off the highway?
We shut that off. I thought I shut it off. Could you say that again?
Is that going to be an issue where people just come off the highway to visit?
There's a self-pay station at the entrance.
I see.
With my experience, I've been at Lake Scott for 20 years. You're still going to have a certain percentage of people that are just going to try to take the chance. And it's the same at every state park. I don't think that will ever change. And we've had very good compliance. But there is a few. And we've had a couple of, we did have a vehicle get broke into one day. There was actually, during a mild blizzard, we had 2 gentlemen from New Mexico out on the trail. They're the only vehicle in the parking lot. They are halfway down the Life on the Rocks trail. They hear their car alarm go off. They come back, past your window smashed, wallet's gone. But we're looking into some cameras. And I've even bought a couple of dummy cameras that say this area is under surveillance. So, but that happens everywhere.
Hey, Greg, the 2 trails you showed, they're open to people to walk in, and then it's the interior that you get a guided tour of.
Yes, and during the summer, we're still working with Steve and Linda, kind of a schedule on how the guided tours work. Obviously, Friday, Saturday, Sundays would be really probably the busiest times. Right now, I think we're doing tours on Tuesdays, but I think we're going to switch it to Fridays, off-season, so people can still come out. And we do get probably 20 phone calls a day. I need a tour. I want a tour. What do I got to get a tour? So, yeah, the phone is crazy with people calling about this place.
So, Mr. Chair, I have a question. And I was trying to remember when we were, Steve may know the answer to this, either you or Greg. We were building the fence. Somebody was telling us, I think it was one of you two guys, kept telling us, turn that limestone so that the fossils point toward the parking lot. Who was it that said that?
You can take credit.
So it was one of you two guys. Well, so I thought, gosh, talk about pain in the rear. You know, we're wrestling around these limestone rocks, and why are we bothering with this? Opening day, a lady came up to me and said, you know, one of the neat things I noticed, you guys took care to turn all those rocks so the fossils always pointed toward the parking lot. I thought, you guys are smart. So I was impressed. So the point is, all the big picture stuff's done, but the detail is amazing. These folks pay attention to. The only one other thing I want to make clear is, and this, because this was a revelation to me, as I travel around the parks and talk about when we're doing what we're doing and just listen to these people talk, I've been amazed when they say, well, yeah, we'll get to this in the winter. And when they say we'll get to it, they mean they're going to do it in the winter. These folks in our parks group are electricians, they're the construction managers. I mean, they do all this stuff. And I had no idea before I took this position that they contract out some, but it's amazing the amount of work that they take on themselves to save this state money. It's very impressive. Thank you.
Lauren, do you have
I just was curious if you've had feedback from the families that donated the property, and are they pleased and satisfied with what they've seen and how it's being handled?
You know, they were there, and they couldn't have been more proud. We actually let them speak. They're part of it. We expect them to be a part of it. Their families were there, so, yes. And it was an agent, I just want to say one more time, it was an agency effort, and with new secretary coming in, he did a great job, let us continue to do the work there. He didn't pressure us to open it too soon, and I appreciate that with you, because we could have opened it sooner and it just wasn't quite ready. So, again, tourism helped us, everybody helped us get this open. We don't get to do this very often, so it's pretty incredible. We'd love for you to come out.
Hey, any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Scott Riffle Beetle. See if I can see it from here.
All right, thank you for having me. I thought this would be a fitting time to talk about the Scott Riffle beetle since we're out here in Scott City. Start with a little bit of the conservation history of the species. It's a relatively new species to science. It was first described in 1978. And after it was described as a new species, it was listed as state threatened. In the 80s, Dr. Leonard Farrington did a population study just to get a handle on what the population looked like at that time. And then in 1990, the Kansas Biological Survey went and did a distributional survey looking for other locations because at the time, Scott State Park was the only place that we knew the species occurred. So the Kansas Biological Survey went and surveyed sites and springs at several different other states, and they found close relatives of the Scott Riffle beetle, but to this point, the only place that we know the Scott Riffle beetle exists is still in Scott State Park. And a very small area, too. So following that survey, the species was uplisted to state endangered just because we knew that it was an isolated species. Recovery plan was developed in 2002. And most recently, the species was petitioned for federal listing. And because the life history was largely unstudied for the species, we decided to do some more surveys to see how the population was currently doing. And following those surveys, as part of the listing procedure for the Federal Endangered Species Act, the Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a species status assessment. And they came out with their listing decision this year, and if you haven't heard what that is, I'm going to keep you on the hook for just a little bit longer. And this is the only place that we know that Scott riffle beetle occurs. It's in a very small spring here in the park. It's a very unique area to western Kansas, and has remained pretty stable for the beetle. So just to talk a little bit more about the species status assessment process, it looks at the species' current conditions, what their resources are, what threats there are, and it does some forecasting. And based on some plausible scenarios, looks at potential future conditions of the species. So one of the parts of that is identifying some of the threats, and one that was identified was potential for non-native species. And we did shock up some fish below the habitat that were non-native, including this giant goldfish. But for the most part, these fish can't access the area where most of the beetles are anyways, so they're really not that much of a concern, but it's something to keep an eye on. Also, habitat disturbance and degradation. People, getting into the spring could affect the beetle, but there are signs up to say to not do that, and park staff drives past this area probably no less than 30 times a day. So not really too much of a concern. Groundwater quality, obviously, since they rely on the water from the spring, they need to have high quality groundwater. And then also the potential dewatering of the Ogallala Aquifer, which we'll look at. And this picture shows what the spring looked like in 1947 versus 2018. And you can see it looks a lot different. At some point, they went in and broke out all that concrete. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that the habitat has been changed quite a bit over time, but the species still exists there. And just to touch on groundwater quality or groundwater dewatering, the Ogallala Aquifer in some places has been, heavily used. We're kind of fortunate where Scott State Park sits that there's this geological feature, I guess been termed the Scott County Trough, which is an area of deeper aquifer that is less utilized and has a much better groundwater resource than the areas that have been overused. And there's just another illustration of what that Scott County Trough looks like in the position of the park. And so another threat we wanted to look at is potential for drought to affect the species. So we looked at the precipitation between years when the 1980 study was done to when we did our study. So 1980s here, and when we did our study. And you can see that the species experienced a number of droughts, but that spring habitat has been very stable for the species. And as a result, we compared our data to the 1980s data and found that the population numbers between the 80s and now were statistically insignificant, showing that the population has remained stable and has not experienced a decline. So the point I want to make is that the species has been through a number of things, but has remained very stable over the last 30 years. Another thing we wanted to look at during the species status assessment is what conservation actions can we complete to make this species more resilient. And I'll touch on some of these in a little more detail a little bit later on. But one of the things we did was install a remote water quality monitoring station out there. It's solar powered, takes a sample every hour, operates all year long. I can pull up our water quality data 180 miles away in Pratt and know exactly what's going on in the spring. And that just gives us a lot better idea of what's going on in the habitat. And we look at a number of different things from dissolved oxygen to nitrates, all those kinds of things. And so this is just a graphic of dissolved oxygen. This is a week's worth of data. You can see the daily fluctuation of dissolved oxygen in the water due to photosynthesis. That's pretty neat data, but it also gives us confidence that the species has what it needs to keep thriving. So I just wanted to pull a couple excerpts from the news release that the Fish and Wildlife Service gave based on their listing decision. I'll let you folks read those, but basically what it comes down to is they decided not to list the species based on its stability over time and based on the efforts that our department has made to take care of the species. And I think that's a good affirmation for the species resiliency and the ability of our department to manage the species at the state level, and have to give credit to the parks staff out there that have done an excellent job of managing the habitat over all this time. So I've been working with Greg to establish a management plan, and really most of these things are things he's already doing. It's just kind of a way of getting it in writing for future staff so that they're aware. And there are still a few things we might want to do. There are some trees growing up in the spring area that could be, drawing a little bit more water, but that's really, like I said, just to kind of help build resiliency for the future. And it's still on our list, so we're gonna keep an eye on it for the foreseeable future, and try and keep everything up to date as possible. So with that, I'll take any questions.
When the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, when this was petitioned for listing, who was the petitioner?
It was the Wild Earth Guardians. It was part of one of those giant petitions that had 60,
70 million species,
a lot of species
from people who play with their phones on downtown Manhattan and Starbucks.
I don't know any of them personally.
Yes, I understand. I've only read about them. And so I guess we're pleased that it occurred that way, since we would not now be forced to deal with unfunded federal mandates. The next question I have is just more in just general interest. In 1978, did somebody say that's a strange looking beetle? Or how'd this come up? I
think the story goes, I think there was a class out there for a field trip, and it was maybe an entomology field trip, and they collected some specimens and took them back. And actually one of I think it was at OU, and I think David White, the guy that described it, is a leading expert in riffle beetles, and said that is something different, and so he went on to describe it as a different species.
It's okay. Are there other questions from the commission? All right, thank you. I see Tom all queued up back there, but why don't we take a 10-minute break unless we have more questions? Oh, yes, please.
I was just going to ask, do you monitor the stream flow quantity? My name's Greg Graff, I live with Leota, but I'm on the local groundwater board that covers that area. So we work with the water quantity a lot. So we have same surface water monitoring wells. I think Brad's familiar with these. KGS has put in 4 continuous ones in our GMB, but we put in 6 other ones. One of those we put just upstream from this deal to kind of monitor what's happening with the surface water. So if we see something drastic happen that might affect that spring, maybe we'll be ahead of it. And that's on our GMB1 website if you want to keep track of that. So. Sure, and we do have a pressure transducer at that site to monitor the surface water. It is going on there. But just if you ever need any help or anything, the GMD would be more than glad. It's been on our radar since back in the 80s too, and real concern. And if it got too much on the federal, we might want to shut wells down for a long ways back. So, but we've had tools in the last 8-10 years. We can start working on managing that a little better. Hopefully, within just a few years, there will be a mandatory Lima or local mass manager put in place with Scott County. Wichita County's going to have one within a year, and then we're going to work on the other counties. So the goal is to get the aquifer sustainable in this GMD. We're highly depleted already, but So there's a lot of work going on with that affects us. I just wanted to make you aware of what we were doing as a GMB. We don't have near the resources of what, for you to do the rest of it. We're really concerned about it. And anything you have with quantity or quality, sure, let us know. If there's something we can do to address it, I'm sure we'll.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, let's take a 10-minute break. All right.
Good call.
All right, Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, and welcome public. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service considers states' requests to change their duck hunting zone boundaries every 5 years. The next opportunity for Kansas to alter their duck hunting zone boundaries will be for the 2021-2022 seasons. However, any changes must be submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service by May 1st of 2020. Zoning is simply the establishment of independent seasons in 2 or more parts within a state for the purpose of providing more equitable distribution of harvest opportunity. Zoning enhances the state's ability to match season dates with available habitat types, migration chronology, and season preferences of the duck hunters' specific areas. The briefing item lists the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service guidelines and zone options. Of particular to note that zoning only applies to Kansas low plains zones. The high plains unit of the western third of Kansas boundary is not part of this process. The zones have to be contiguous, and zone split configurations must conform to one of the options listed in the briefing item. Since 1972, Kansas waterfowl seasons have had zones or splits in their seasons, with the late zones being added in 1996 and the southeast zone in 2011. As zones and splits are partly based off hunter preference, KDWP&T strongly integrates hunter feedback into their decision-making process. As part of this, 6 public meetings were held in early August to garner waterfowl hunter input, and we are currently conducting a survey of Kansas waterfowl hunters. Although zone boundaries are in place for 5 years, season dates and bag limits may be adjusted annually. If no changes are adopted, the zones will continue as they have been since the 2016 to 2020 hunting seasons. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Are there any questions for Tom?
I'd read in the minutes of the meeting at Great Bend that you had was there some type of federal meeting that you went to?
No, the service in October, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Regulatory Commission or Committee met, and they're the ones that reviews the state or the flyaway recommendations for seasons frameworks. So the SRC develops the overall federal frameworks that's then signed by the Department of the Secretary, and that kind of gives us an overarching which we can develop our seasons from.
Did they have any
regarding
changes or
regarding zones and splits? So there was a 3 flyway recommendation to do away with the contiguous requirement and also allow to have 3 segments. And but the Fish and Wildlife Service chose not to adopt that.
Wonder why? What would be the?
One is complexity of regulations, even though zone boundaries themselves are already complex, but it was as part of that, and also how it would ways to be able to monitor how it would change distribution or hunters' participation in the process.
You know, one of the issues that I have with zoning is the early zone where you have to track clear up to Jamestown is a problem. It's a problem for the state. And do you see any way some way, being able just to surround Jamestown and not have to go? If you guys will look on the page, you'll see how they have to get McPherson and the Bottoms and Texas Lake and some of them, and then the zone goes clear up into Jamestown. And what that does between 183 and 281 highway is that gets people in trouble with hunting dates.
Yes, as you remember, we did make that carve out in 2015 to allow Cedar Bluff.
Right.
And, Actually, it was Kansas that presented to the flyways and also petitioned the other flyways to support that recommendation to the contiguous requirement, mostly because of the Jamestown. The Pacific Flyway actually gave a pretty good argument for them for a lot of their mountainous areas, that some of those valleys work better because, you're basically setting the season based off habitat type, not more or less off, what it states.
You were saying that it was suggested that what Troy's talking about, the lack of necessity of being contiguous was presented, and the agency and the service said no.
Correct.
I could see if we were able to put Jamestown and then have it as a separate zone, it would make it easier. And the recommendations that you're going to have is that no changes and we'll have these same boundaries for another 5 years.
Well, I said we're still in the decision-making process. We have an ongoing survey that should be completed by December, and that will what we'll use to develop our regulations. During our public feedback from our scoping meetings, we did not hear a large call for zone boundary changes.
And I thought there might be, but there was not.
No.
But you mentioned that at the public meetings, you did have people talking about later season opening dates.
No, for a number of years, there is a vocal contingent of hunters that are preferring late season dates, and the January 31st is another indicator that, that there probably be a lot of hunters that are wanting later dates, and, there's looking at options to accommodate that.
And I guess I bring this up because I mentioned it some time ago. I wanted to move at least a week ahead on starting date for late season, late season, low zone. How am I saying that wrong?
Late season, low plains, late
Low
zone.
plain. I mentioned that, and then carry it through the holidays. I was complaining about not being able to hunt January 1st, that through those holidays. And I guess my point to that is in the current Wildlife and Parks summary of the reports of the duck counts, November 12th in Cedar Bluff, the season opened October 26th. There were 7,000 ducks at Cedar Bluff, 10,000 ducks at Glen Elder. Jamestown had 3,000. Lovewell had 6,000. Would you agree that those counts will be significantly higher in later December and January?
Depending on the area. We've had 2 freezes this year. We've had a freeze of 3 days, and we're currently in a freeze now for 4 days on some of our wildlife areas, but that does not affect our large reservoirs, but it does affect some of the small areas, and some of this, particularly those for some of our dabbling duck species, particularly areas that people are hunting small playas or wetlands and small impoundments.
If you look at southwest Kansas, the current report, Cheyenne Bottoms, November 14th, less than 2,000 ducks.
Again, they had 2 inches of ice of yesterday morning.
Isabella, 150 ducks.
Again, also under ice.
Yeah, Texas Lake, no waterfowl observed.
Again, under ice.
Yeah. I'd like to revisit those counts in December and January and show that there's just more waterfowl in Kansas at later dates.
It depends on the type of hunting that you prefer to doing.
It's just something, it's a trend, it's coming. It's just part of it. And obviously, we've talked about this. If we could get the feds to give us, 10 more days, 10 more days would solve our problems. It would pretty much solve everybody's problems. We could probably do away with the zone if we got 10 more days.
And again, that's one of the options we were looking with the revision of the Mid-Continent Mallard Adaptive Harvest Management Plan. It does get tied with other species like with pintails, wood ducks, scaup, some of the other species and restrictions that are impacted when you start adding days to the season.
Mm-hmm. Was there any talk at this meeting with the feds of more days?
Yes, again, it's part of that double looping process with adaptive harvest management.
Thank you, Tom.
Any other questions for Tom? Any questions from the public? Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Rich?
Thank you, Chairman Lobbin and Commissioners. I'm here today to discuss webless migratory game bird seasons and regulations. In your briefing book, I included a summary of those regulations that pertain to these species, so you can refer to that as I go through some of these, the summary today. There is one pending change to federal frameworks that would apply to webless migratory game birds for the 2020-21 seasons, and that's an extension of the latest season date possible for rail season to January 31st, similar to what we've seen for duck season. It was previously the last Sunday of January. However, that change is not likely to affect permanent regulations or staff recommendation for rail season. We closed well before that in early November, so that change doesn't really have a big impact on what we might expect for rail season for the coming year. There is one regulation that staff are considering changes to, and that's KR 115-2520, and that regulation pertains to sandhill crane hunting and the seasons in Kansas. Federal frameworks do permit in the state of Kansas that we could have zoning to the area that's open to sandhill crane hunting. We could split that into different zones and have different season dates in those zones, and that's something we are considering for the upcoming season. And the recommendations coming from staff will be presented at our January commission meeting, so we'll have multiple workshop sessions to consider those recommendations and what the commission might want to go forward with from there. So the table provided at the bottom of that briefing book item summarizes all the remaining bag possession limits and season dates as they currently stand in permanent regulation for 2020-2021 seasons. And with that, I'm happy to stand for questions.
Do we count any of the webless migratory birds or have an indication of the number?
Like surveys, like how many are on the landscape?
Yes.
Type counting. Sandhill cranes would be one that come to mind. For the majority of the others, not on a regular basis. A lot of them are pretty, could be pretty difficult. We do some estimates. We could produce some estimates for mourning doves based on some banding activities and things like that, so we could come up with indices. But actual targeted surveys like we do biweekly duck and goose surveys, and sandhill cranes are included on that survey, so that would be the one that comes to mind. But it'd be a pretty difficult ask to do a Virginia rail survey on a weekly
Sure.
basis.
And, over the years when I used to hunt a lot of quail back when there was more quail and it was a different time, we'd see a lot of woodcock. And I have no idea now whether I haven't seen a woodcock knowingly in a long time. And I don't know whether or not we have any little test sites or any way we can tell whether there's more or less.
So most of the information for a lot of these species, the monitoring programs, these are birds that migrate. So pretty much every species we have something the Fish and Wildlife Service bases any of their recommendations on. And for example, for woodcock, that has to do with a breeding ground calling survey, and that occurs in northern states where the majority of their breeding population occurs during that time. Similar to waterfowl, the population estimates, those population surveys are done on the breeding grounds for ducks and for geese, the same thing for a lot of these webless species as well. So part of the issue is, well, not an issue, but part of it is we don't have a lot of breeding population in the state of Kansas compared to more northern locations.
Anybody else have any questions for Rich? Okay, thank you. Levi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, public, and staff. Here to talk about the big game permanent regulations, KR 115 4 dashes.
start out with 115.4-2, which is the big game general provisions. As we've been discussing so far, we've been looking at a carcass movement restriction for big game carcasses. And I wanted to, so with that, what had been put in the recommendation was that carcasses would be restricted to the deer management units in which they were harvested, and only allow the clean antlers or clean antlers attached to a clean skull plate, hide without skull or meat attached, finished taxidermy mounts, boned out meat or quartered carcasses without the head and spinal column attached to be possessed, crossing that. And then also allowing the tissues needed for disease sampling to be possessed. And I'd like to take a few minutes and kind of run through some other states around us. It's kind of a little bit hard to see. So Kansas is at the top there with basically no restrictions. And with this, I focused on the states that had already detected CWD within their state. Oklahoma, I've not seen any regulations specific to this. They do have a no dumping of carcasses regulation, although that most relates to water sources and human inhabited dwellings. Nebraska also has nothing as far as in regulation, although they do recommend following BMPs of leaving head and spine or deboning meat entirely. Colorado is also currently the same thing. And then we get to Missouri. They have regulations about movement within and importing carcasses within the state. And it pretty well follows what we had in ours as far as deboned meat, quarters without spine and head, antlers, antlers attached to skull plate, finished taxidermy. They do have some exceptions, and that's if a carcass is being taken to a licensed taxidermist or processor, and they are considering a exception for that should be, or it's actually already through, it will be in place, but an exception for a head with the cape attached importing going directly to a taxidermist. But they do license as a department their taxidermists and processors. Arkansas also has very similar rules as far as within their CWD zones and deer coming into the state, although they have no exceptions for taxidermists and processors that I've seen. Wyoming includes regulations basically doing the same thing. You can take the whole carcass provided you've actually removed the spinal column, stays at the kill, or stay at the site of the kill, or goes to a landfill. And then the deboned meat, clean hides, best management practice type stuff. They also include a regulation that you can't actually take animals outside of the state under the same regulations. North Dakota has a very similar within state and importing. And although they allow an exception for carcasses that are going to go through the state. So a hunter that killed an animal outside of the state is passing through the state to another state that resides in another state can take those whole carcasses through as long as no part is left. Let's see, Texas has also within from their zones and for importing animals pretty much all those same parts for best management that would be mentioned that we had before. Although they have a head waiver form that a hunter has to register and have a waiver for that head to indicate that it's going to a taxidermist specifically. And can I get the next slide, please?
Let me ask you a question now. These states that have regulation, are they fairly recent regulations, or have they been around for a long time?
Some have been around for a few years, and some are actually going to be in place for this coming season, next 2020 season.
So the ones that have been around for a while, have they noticed any effect on the incidence of chronic wasting?
It's a hard one because usually what we find is we can't see much for the positive, but we sure see the negative when we don't have it. For the folks that I've been able to talk to about it, have seen that, the majority of hunters are willing to comply and do so. But they do see that some folks just ignore the regulations. We had an incident where a deer left Kansas and went to Ohio, even though they had just implemented their ban and had well publicized it. So it does still happen. It's the curb the ones that will comply. I mean, we know that there will be folks that will ignore it.
The two that I'm familiar with that are going into effect now, that maybe aren't into effect yet, is Missouri and Minnesota.
Yep.
But there are two things that are different, Levi, about Missouri and Minnesota, is that the restrictions occur within the CWD management zones. And in our case, that would be counties that have had a previous test,
Yep.
not a statewide thing.
Yep.
And that's a big difference. And if you look at the presentation on Missouri, it doesn't show that. It would make it think that it's a statewide, but it is not.
It is within their zones, but their zones are also small and would be basically, in many cases, smaller than our units, because their zones are staggered around the state where they've detected it.
Right. And
So-
I guess my point, and I mentioned this, well, we'll go on. You finish your presentation.
Okay. So, again, most states are still following those best management stuff. The Dakotas with that. Again, you can move carcasses within those zones that are adjacent to each other. Illinois only has a ban on importing carcasses. Iowa only has a ban on importing. Ohio is one of the states that has not yet detected it, and they're only looking at import. Minnesota, again, you are correct that they allow within those zones to move it. Wisconsin allows carcasses to go directly to taxidermists and processors, but you have to register that you're going to do that. Okay, I have another slide of the states. Michigan, again, you can have carcasses within the zones. And you can, again, register your head up there to go outside of it. Mississippi doesn't allow any exceptions that I've been able to find within import. New Mexico only lists within their state. Montana is also within, although their regulations basically say no brain or spinal cord tissue can be possessed. And Tennessee then too, you can have them within the zones. You can go from a low-risk zone into a high-risk zone, but you can't go from a high-risk CWD zone outside. And then Virginia and West Virginia, import, Virginia also has within. So very similar across these. There are a few differences here and there within it. And so it's not in the recommendation listed in the briefing booklet, but what we'd like to do or consider moving forward is to change the proof of sex regulations to allow for quartering carcasses without having to do the photo check by maintaining a part of the hide attached to a quarter that has the genitalia on it. And that would allow hunters to do this on a voluntary basis. And then with the, we have not received the input expected from this potential change that we are considering. And there's some opportunity in discussion with some of my counterparts outside the state that we may be able to craft this to better align state to state, which then basically hunters coming from out of state to Kansas that have to follow our regulations then are basically following all the states in between theirs to make it easier for hunters to handle. And so we would not recommend a carcass restriction at this time, and we'll take some more time to investigate it. We've been discussing a task force where we can bring in some of the processors and taxidermists and gather more input on this. And then we also, would like some, it gives us a little more time to solve the issue of the European mounts, which in looking through all the other states' regulations, most have not had an adequate solution to that either. And so that's what we're looking at right now. That's the development that's happened after the briefing book was published.
Okay. Can I go ahead? Are you ready for questions?
Yep.
Okay. Is the recommendation listed in the briefing book now the current thought process on the regulation, or have we backed off that a little bit?
A little bit. If you go to the last paragraph that just talks about the proof of sex and what would be required as proof of sex.
All right.
Right now, that's what we'd consider proceeding with.
Okay. What about carcass movement? That's the question I had. Is that not in the recommendation at this time?
At this time, we want to step back so we can, gather better evidence and look at that.
I've talked to a couple, and one in detail of a processor, all of which want to help the CWD problem, all of which ask me for a little scientific explanation, and of course no one can give them very much. I think we're not ready for heavy restrictions on carcass movement outside of the CWD zones if we were to have CWD zones. Yep. I think you're going to have people, and the reason you're not getting any input, people just don't know this is happening.
Yeah.
I mean, and I ask people, are you worried?
Yep. And that's another reason is to get this more well publicized.
But the legislature, again, will understand it because, I don't know how many locker plants we have, but I think if we were to work with the locker plants that deal with, or meat processing plants, I think we could get a lot of compliance. Missouri has language, if you're in a zone, you've got a designated landfill. Now, I ask a meat processor, do you know where you have a designated? He has no idea.
Yep.
Basically what he does is National Byproducts, and I think their name is either Darting or Darling, they charge him a fee.
Yep.
Now, there are certain places like Wyoming, they will actually put roll-off containers, and people are happy because they pay now to have them delivered. If if there's a way we can figure out how to help these people,
yep.
we could, but we're going to have to be involved. For us just to say, no carcass movements, best practice,
Yep.
It's going to blow up on us.
Yeah, and that's given us some more time, but we've started the discussion, and that's what's important.
We need to
really
continue the discussion because this won't go away.
It's not going to.
I'm not sure we'll ever fix it, but it's not going away.
Yep. And
many states have those exceptions for animals going to taxidermists or to processors. Most of those states that have those, their state agency regulates those. But, with some of that, it's, we could look at potentially some way to assist with that kind of thing. And a lot of those states, it's got to go to a landfill. Or a renderer, which would be the byproducts.
Well.
And so that's something,
They're going
it's a
to a
harder question
renderer
for
now,
us.
but the renderer that is the statewide leader doesn't want any potential of CWD in their assembly line.
Yeah, and their byproduct.
Yeah, they just, you have to sign, when I take a deer in, they require that you sign, this has not been tested. And they won't pick up the animals if not every carcass gets, and so that's the only place these meat processors have. I'm guessing that we have 35 to 40,000 deer processed professionally in the state of Kansas. That's assuming that out of the 80,000 that we harvested, half of them went to a third party to be to be dealt with. And those people would like to work with us.
Yep. And
we just don't want to push them out of business.
Many of those folks have different requirements on what shows up there. A lot of them are, quite a few anyways, that I've talked to have been, they require that, no spine shows up at there. They want quartered or deboned already. So, and I've met several hunters that have the same.
I believe you, but I just don't know of anybody that won't take a whole carcass.
Yeah.
Same way Wyoming, any place else. I don't know any place that requires boning unless they're just going to make summer sausage or something.
Yep.
And they don't take them in any case.
Yep.
Are there other questions for Levi?
Any updates on test methods of getting more accurate, quicker testing?
Nothing yet right now. There's a few different groups that are talking about working on trying to get some quicker tests developed. That's, the early stages of actually doing the research into it. Our current time frame in Kansas is including shipping. We're getting them turned around in about 2 weeks coming back from the K-State Diagnostic Lab.
Well, I have a problem with the whole concept of the definition of clean skull and making regulation and putting law enforcement in charge. I just think it's a huge mistake to put law enforcement in charge of somebody that may move a carcass a mile or two outside of the boundaries. I think education is the best way to go. Maybe go back to check stations, more accurate testing, and just start educating the public. And maybe start educating the public this season. Get publications out that, you would rather not see carcass movement and get people thinking about it. I just think it's a problem for our state. It's a problem for our industry. It's a problem for law enforcement to not think about this a little bit. And I understand we need to do something. I do understand that. Thank you.
How many cases of CWD are verified annually here?
We have verified, I think, 400 some since we've started testing.
Yeah, and what period of time?
And that would be 2005 is when we first detected it.
And we're seeing more signs of it. We know.
More signs of it. It's not easy to go with what we detect, verify annually, because we change our disease zones.
Yeah.
And so if we're sampling like we are this year in the Northwest zone, where the core area of CWD in Kansas, where it first started in wild herd, we're going to get a lot more detections versus in a couple of years when we go to eastern Kansas.
Yeah, I'm just trying to gauge the sense of urgency that we need to understand on this.
It's thankfully a slow-moving disease, provided we don't help it.
Yeah.
So.
Are we testing more than we did?
We're trying to,
I mean, the more you test, the more
but
positives you
most
have.
of what we get outside of the number that we need to do, to conduct our prevalence analysis are private submission stuff. We're into discussions on a research project into getting a better handle on CWD in the state, as far as more detailed sampling, collecting more. So,
Well, the deer hunters I've talked to, if CWD is a serious problem, and they believe it is, they're willing to do whatever it takes. And it would be nice, if we could see, for example, in these other states where they're beginning to get a handle on it and stop the spread and get some control, where they've got the regulations so that we can, have a relationship between the regulation and the.
yep. And we're in the middle of a human dimensions survey where we're questioning those agencies about what they've done and whether or not they've measured how those regulations have impacted what's going on. So that's in the process.
Aren't a lot of these really so new they don't know?
There's a lot.
I mean,
that's
like
just-
in the case of Minnesota and Missouri, I mean, it hadn't even taken effect in their state yet.
Yeah.
It's that new.
Yep.
And I think they're letting those areas that have had positive tests bear the brunt while other people can see it and try to go to great lengths not to have it show up in their area.
Yep.
Brad, did you have a?
Yeah, a couple things. One point and a question. The point is that the thing we're really trying to avoid is the jumping of it, because this will leapfrog. It takes one carcass to leapfrog, and then all of a sudden the whole picture in Kansas changes. If we can keep it at a slow expansion, that would be success for us. The other thing, to Commissioner Gefeller's question about numbers of deer, can you give the commissioners an idea of maybe percentages of deer that you expect are infected as you look at the zone out west?
So in the core zone, we're looking at about 15 to 25%, potentially 30 prevalence rate. And that is, from limited info over the last couple of years, because we're back in there for the first time from 5 years ago, sampling this year, so we'll have a better idea with more data. But that's about the number. We're expecting to see that increase this year, since it's been that 5 years. And there was a recent study that shows that, if we can keep prevalence rates below 10%, then our deer herd can maintain at least stability, if not still be able to increase when we need it to. But if we get above that, they start seeing some pretty good population declines that.
Are we seeing those declines in those areas that have as high as 25% yet?
We are.
Or do we really know?
Up in those areas, there is some decline over the last few years. It's been pretty slow, thankfully. And we're in our, in the current time frame of the year when we do our population samples, our spotlight surveys right now. And so.
Is there any indication that a deer can test positive but not die from it?
Yeah. In fact, usually what happens is they don't necessarily die from CWD, but it puts them in such a poor body condition that they'll die from pneumonia or some other infection. But
I understand, but could you be a carrier and just look like a normal deer until you die?
A deer will look like a normal deer and carry it for 12 to 18 months, and they don't display any outward symptoms until the last couple months of life.
There's a variety of cattle diseases that you can have cattle be carriers, but they never really transmit it. They never have any externalized symptoms, and I'm wondering if we know whether deer can do that or not. 25% seems high, and it seemed like if you had 25% of your deer, and you didn't say 20, you'd have 15 to 20, but if that seems high, and it seemed like in that case, if few years, you'd have 25% of your herd die annually. And considered hunting pressure, you'd really begin to drop your numbers.
Well, and, potentially what we see is that, hunting removes a lot of positive animals. That's one of the recommendations, is that hunting seasons be moved later. And, in most states you're talking about moving hunting season later, they're talking about taking them into November. And our rifle season's already in December. So a lot of those animals that may have been very recently infected are removed because they may be more vulnerable and, maybe they're not as aware as a healthy deer is potentially. But some animals will die sooner. The other thing is that with being able to live for 18 months, they can get through a full breeding cycle and have fawns. And so, that
Can you pass the disease on from a doe to a fawn?
You can. So, yep.
It's comforting.
You mentioned that you're testing now in northwest Kansas. Can you tell us your testing method, where you test?
So, we use the retropharyngeal lymph nodes up in the neck, shortly behind the skull, or the obex, which is the brainstem. And so that is taken out of the deer, put in a jar of formalin, and our samples go to the Kansas State Vet Lab. And if a hunter wants to do that, they can, or do a private submission, they can get on the K-State Vet Lab website or call them and get a kit sent to them. In the zone where we are, there's certain taxidermists that are listed in our regulation summary booklet that are cooperating and collecting samples for us. Or they can contact one of our staff to get assistance in getting that done. And if it's within the zone and before we've reached our 450 sample limit or goal, we will cover that.
Are you going into the locker plants and where are you getting the deer?
Mostly it's being done through taxidermists and our staff in the field. There are a few locker plants that do it themselves though too.
Okay, like a conservation officer, would he be able to do it? Or?
Yes.
Other questions for Levi?
Levi, carcass management's just one, it's a significant piece, but it's just one piece of this. Are we just taking one piece at a time? Is there a more comprehensive plan to deal with the reduction of concentrations?
We're building a more complex plan with that, but this is kind of the first step in the process of what we've got to take care of as we move forward. There'll be other things that can be implemented fairly quickly, but even getting into consideration for short distance movement and stuff, we've got to consider the leapfrog of long distance movements potentially first.
Lauren has a good point. There's the issues of feeding, baiting, captive cervids. Probably carcass movement is the biggest. Human assistance is probably the biggest way to get it to jump around. But there are other things that are out there that have an additive effect and affect the transmission of the disease.
Yep.
Other questions? Go ahead. Lauren.
I have thought long and hard about this. This really hit home to me after you've, at some previous meetings, informed us. And in August, I was out bird watching at Rocky Mountain Arsenal. And in a couple hours out there, I couldn't tell you how many mule deer that we saw that were not normal deer. And my suspicion is that they were heavily infected with CWD. These deer were not normal at all. And that visual struck home to me. As an avid deer hunter, I'm thinking, how do I do this? And I'm passionate enough, I said this last time, I will figure out a way to make it happen. But the reality, when I was out in October, had my little nephew out, got his first deer, we got 2 deer down on the ground, and I'm thinking, what if I had to do this right now? So I took them to a processor in Pratt County in Unit 16, and while I was there, I said, so if some of this regulation about restriction of movement was put in place, what would happen for you and your business? You're a meat processor and a taxidermist. He's in Unit 16, and the corner of Unit 15 is 100 yards down the road. He and his wife talked about it. He said, our business would be cut in half by about 50%. Okay, and you know what that means for me is now I lose my processor in 16 because he can't stay in business. So I would like to make a proposal or throw it out for conversation at least. I appreciate the idea of a task force, but the reality is we've got to get public buy-in, public support, and avoid some of the potential irritation of legislators. Because if we make some drastic moves, there is potential that there would be a legislative reaction that lacks solid biology and solid sociology. And I think that's a worse problem. My thoughts on one place to start is to start a large collaborative group that includes meat processors, taxidermists, KDHE, NGOs like Kansas Feeding the Hunters, or Hunters Feeding the Hungry, Department of Ag, a legislator, hunters, an outfitter, representative from the department, federal agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because those populations on the federal refuges, as I saw in Colorado, if you've got isolated populations there that aren't hunted, your evidence and your incidence of CWD goes up. It's almost more, Mr. Secretary, I guess a question to you, because that's far more than Levi's purview, but is that not a reasonable way to find collaboration and consensus on the best approaches and to get some public education going and some buy-in so that we have a large process and are not just hitting this piece? Okay, first we're going to deal with carcass, and now we're going to deal with baiting and feeding. It's a pretty major thought, but I'd sure like to throw it out there.
So I think it's a great thought, because obviously we know we make better decisions when we include all those folks, and we have to be informed by all the stakeholders, and you listed a great long list of them there. What I would say is, I guess I would caution us if we're organizing a group of that size, which would be very large and diverse, and if we're waiting on them, what I'd probably recommend is that we do that. And we're doing some of that outreach already, but I doubt if it's to any of our satisfactions. But that intentional outreach where we work with those folks, whether or not they're all sitting in the same room, or we get those meat processors all together at one time and get them all to, develop a consensus, or however we do it. But I think you make a great point that we need to be intentional at inviting their input, informing them fully, and inviting that input. And while we're pursuing these things based on the best science and the experience that we get from other states that are in the middle of this right now with us, but reach out to those folks and be very intentional about it. And we haven't done as good a job of that as we should. So I think it's a great idea. How we format it, we'd have to talk about it and ask how we can be most efficient. But the end result in getting input from those critical stakeholders is absolutely important and a great idea. I agree.
Well, one of the things that I'm pleased with is that this recommendation of carcass movement is going to go backwards. You're backing off a little bit while we get more information, because if that was coming to us as a vote pretty soon, that's going to be tough to do. And I'm glad to kick that can down the road and see if we can't come up with something else, because I'm not sure we would be successful in getting that through. I think that you know, this administration and the previous administration have a keen focus on rural economic development. And, you know, you take the meat packer, the processing plant you're talking about, it's not inconceivable that during the primary firearms deer season, they could have a $75,000 cash injection that has 3 or 4 guys who get part-time income, a big boost for the locker plant. And if they leave, they'll close up. And then we're going to have to explain why we didn't think about that, even though you didn't cause the disease. You're just trying to deal with it before we don't say, man, I wish we'd have done something earlier, which is why the best practices, we're scrambling, trying to get something done. Any other questions from any of the commissioners?
Just another comment. It does seem to me there is a sense of urgency on this, and that we do need to take the long view. I mean, if we let the disease get out of hand, it's going to severely damage our hunting experience and the economic viability of the processors. So, you know, I think we need to move forward with some speed. Chairman's right. We need to be sure that we do something that we can pass. But I, for one, would like to see it happen with a sense of urgency. And just one more question: if the processor is the largest component to the problem, why can't you just have movement zones around processors and not necessarily have to stay within zones?
Well, and that's something else that, is, something we were looking at with that, is whether or not, the zones are set up in the best way. And some of this, what had been proposed was to mitigate having to stand up here and change zones every year as the disease moves. But, that's one way. It's also with using the zones, those are what hunters are already familiar with as far as the boundaries for units. And so being able to work within that, they don't have to try and learn a whole nother line that they can or can't cross.
I would discourage changing the boundaries from deer management units, but I would think one might want to consider counties or something like that to be able to deal with it. And Warren, I don't know if the problem is necessarily the packing plants so much as they have no place to put the carcass. If there was not necessarily in September when things get ripe quick, but during the regular season, if they had a place to go dump those carcasses and then we would see to it that they got put into a proper landfill, that's the best possible outcome. Right now, they're paying somebody else to take them because they don't know what else to do with them. Yep. All right, well, Levi, thank you. Do you, I'll go look, do you have a second subject here? Yes?
I do. I've got a couple more.
Are you done with this presentation?
I am done with that regulation.
All right.
So, if you are.
We've done, and I appreciate the
Stacy,
department.
you got a comment?
I'm Stacy Amy from Scott City here. I'm farmer rancher, but I farm and ranch in about 5 counties. So, but Levi, we did the deer study. It's on some of our property and everything. So it's gone really good. But how many animals have we lost to chronic wasting?
It's out of that project. I think we're around 10 right now out of 120.
Okay.
So, a few more than that, but.
And then you're talking about public knowledge. It was 2 weeks ago. I had a guy. I watched him shoot a little mule deer buck, and I talked to the game warden, asked him. Well, he shot it in the roadway, but it was on walk-in on both sides, so everything's great on that occasion. But I went and drove down, talked to him to see where he's from. He was out of Topeka, and he was actually quartering it out, but I said, so you taking the skull back with you? And he goes, oh, yeah, I'll take it back to Topeka. And I said, you better check for CWD because it's out here in this county. He goes, oh, that's northwest Kansas. And we're in Gove County. So I said, you're in northwest Kansas. He goes, well, I said, why are you hunting up here and not Topeka? Because he said, well, we used to always hunt south in the southern counties, but the deer numbers keep falling off, so we just started coming up this direction. And we had the same incident. We had a deer shot on walk-in, and it ended up in our ranch, and the game warden came along, and we helped him find the deer, and it half ate. He was taking it all the way back to Wisconsin. So, yeah, you definitely have to worry about traveling. It's a nerve-wracking deal, and our numbers right now are dropping off. It seems like the mule deer numbers seem to be harder and harder to find. I mean, this last year, they've really fallen off, so. But
Do you have whitetail and mule deer?
yes, yeah. And
Are
actually,
the
one of the
whitetail numbers dropping off?
They are. But you just don't notice them as much, I guess, because you just never seen the whitetail quite like you see the mule deer. And that was one of the comments of one of the hunters last year. I drove by and he goes, why can't we have mule deer tags? Because that's all I get to see out here is mule deer. Well, yeah, the mule deer stop and look at you 100 yards away and they won't take off running. But yeah, but the whitetail you have to work for out here because they've learned to bury up and hide up, and you just don't see them standing out. And this time of year you do a little bit, but yeah. But those numbers seem to be, we actually had one on the deer study died on our ranch right on the fence line, and that's what it was, CWD. It just came back. And then another one a mile south of our ranch. We're near the Pyramid Monument Rocks in that area where we're out of. And south of the Monument Rocks, they had another one die, but they're not for sure what. He had the result back on that one, I don't think. But it looked a healthy deer, but it was dead. It was dead deer, no holes in it or anything. So I don't know. But I appreciate you looking at all this. But last year I saw a guy leave out of western Kansas. He shot a little mule deer buck. He threw it on top of his minivan and drove it back to Kansas City. And I said, and I had contact with him. I said, so what'd you do? I said, well, I'm going to drive it in and show my fireman guys. I'm going to drive it in the middle of Kansas City. I'm going to show him my deer I got. So they do a lot of traveling here. So there is a concern on that. And those numbers, I'd hate to see them in eastern Kansas too. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? All right.
All right. So now it's 115-4-4, which is legal equipment. We're still seeking input on the proposed option to remove the prohibition on devices that lock a bow at full or partial draw.
Have you received any?
Other than one person here and during a meeting, that's pretty much, I've not had any phone calls.
I guess I wouldn't know one of those devices unless you pointed it out to me, but I can't see that it's a whole lot different than a trigger on a crossbow, other than it may not be as accurate if you had it. And so I suppose there are some people with age or handicapped or really young that if they feel it would be a benefit. And if so, I just don't know if I haven't seen a downside to it other than it's not sufficiently pure. Is there a downside that's anecdotally discussed with you?
I've heard the same argument about potentially less accurate because you don't have the tension. Mostly what I've heard about them is that they're, considered at some times a safety device with, especially for youth archery, youth starting out, learning how to shoot, that they're not, it won't let them accidentally release an arrow before they're ready if they follow the operation of the piece. So, but I've not, really heard nothing.
I guess I just haven't heard anything other than kind of an ethical argument that it's not as clean and pure. So who you looking for?
I mean,
A proposed option? Do you want,
that's the,
does anybody here not think it's a good idea, have an objection, let's put it that way? I don't know if we care.
Mr. Chairman, I think one of the issues is we answer this question all the time. If I can use a crossbow, why can't I use a draw lock device?
Yeah, I don't see why you can't,
And
but
you
I don't
can
know
by
if I.
special permit, but we don't sell very many, and there's not a high demand there. It just seems inconsistent in our regulations, which is why it's been.
Then I'm going to propose that you go ahead and, if you're looking for input, that's my input, is that we allow it. I'm not sure that I'm a skilled advisor, but anybody else?
When did we start putting in the crossbows? Do you remember?
was it 2011? Thanks.
That's about right.
I think out of respect, the two folks that have spoken to us have spoken negatively, though. So I would hate to override, even though it's not much input.
But what?
That is a consideration, I think.
But their
is to
only
respect
consideration
that.
was that it's cheating.
It's not traditional.
It's not traditional,
No, they
it's not fair.
spoke,
It's like inline muzzleloaders.
I felt like they were emphasizing the fact that it was not as accurate, which leads to ethics of clean kills, too.
Well, yeah, I can see that.
It seems to me these our crossbows, I mean, my gosh, these things are, very easy, and, it's almost like you're shooting a gun, it's like you're shooting a muzzle. It seems to me a little bit like that. It's not the same, I understand that, but I don't know. I guess maybe I'm a little bit on the traditional side when it comes to having crossbows. I have a little bit of hesitation with it. And doing this with the vertical bows causes me hesitation as well, I guess. At what point, and we see this all the time, but at what point do we keep technology in a traditional way to keep the archery separate from the advancements of archery? Where do we draw the line on those in keeping those seasons separate and the technology separate, I guess? I have more of a traditional.
Your input is, and probably Lauren's input, is you don't think we should remove the prohibition.
I would like more input from someone else. I'm just a little hesitant, I guess.
And that's fine with me.
What motivated you to consider this in the first place? Did you have a demand for it, or states around us doing it? Or?
We had a previous commissioner ask us to look into it, and a concern about consistency of regulation.
So,
go ahead.
Well, since I'm new to the commission, what's your practice when you have public hearings and you get no input? Do you move forward with the change the regulation, or do you withdraw the proposal? What's normal?
That depends a lot on what the commission wants to do.
Let me back up and retract my earlier statement. This looks like an ideal situation for a staff recommendation.
Take this one,
Levi. So I deal with staff. I've dealt with staff recommendations I didn't like before. So it's a good time for you to put the burden on you guys. Is that okay with you?
I would say, from what I have seen, that crossbows have had I think, a significant impact on getting youth involved in archery. And maybe this might do that with youth and just getting people out, more outdoors.
Except that the one person pointed out that they're not as accurate. So I don't know whether that, I don't know. They don't really scare me, but I think we'll leave this on staff recommendation. Good thinking there, Levi. Do you have more, Aaron?
No, I think that was it.
Okay. Anybody, any more questions for Levi on that one? Did you got another one?
I do. KR 115-4-6, which is the firearm management units. We've had some requests to change the boundary to be a little more consistent on up by in the urban deer unit, which is unit 19. So I've got a map up there on the screen now. So the southern portion of that blue section that falls below the red line of unit 19 was still under unit 10, which has only been allowed one antlerless permit within it when it was surrounded by areas that allow up to 5. And so to be a little more consistent with that, we're proposing to change the boundary of Unit 19 to from where it meets at Johnson County 199 Street and I-35 and follow I-35 south and west to the junction with Highway US 75, and then follow Highway 75 north to its junction with Shawnee County Southwest 93 to cover that. And then the north boundary has been fairly difficult for hunters to follow. We get quite a few complaints in our Region 2 office in Topeka about that. And so we've looked at trying to simplify that somewhat. And so starting in the west where Northwest Rossville Road meets Northeast 62nd Street and follow Northeast 62nd Street to Kansas Highway 4 and follow Highway 4 to Kansas Highway 92 and then follow Kansas 92 to 207th Street where it would meet back with the original boundary. So that's the black outline is the proposed boundary, and the red line is the current boundary.
Any questions for Levi on that? Okay, will we have another will we vote on this next time? We'll have another workshop.
One more workshop of this.
All right, any other questions? If not, go on to the next one.
And that finishes up what I've got for the permanent regulations, the 115s. And so that would be moving to the 25 series regulations, which sets our seasons. And so with that, we're still considering issuing a few either sex or either species antlerless only permits, up in unit 1 where we've had some complaints about potential damage. That's actually done through the Secretary's orders, but we're asking for input on potentially doing that. That'll be highly contingent on our current year's deer surveys, which are currently underway.
Are the current deer surveys generally showing stability or slight increases?
Pending in that unit, we've seen pretty stable.
What about statewide?
Statewide, We've had some minor increases, mostly due to southern and southeast Kansas. Across the northern, northwest, we've been fairly stable with a few areas that are indicating some decline.
Go ahead.
And then moving to the season dates, everything should follow tradition, except that with the extended whitetail deer season, antlerless only seasons in January, hunters indicated during last year's harvest survey that they wanted more days to hunt and want weekend days included. And in looking at what we're seeing for our population indices, we're looking at potentially working with 3 different season lengths with that, where there'd be a 10-day, a 17-day, and a 24-day proposed for this next year. And so the dates of seasons would actually be then youth and disability would be September 5th through September 13th. Early muzzleloader would be September 14th through September 27th. Archery starts concurrently with the early muzzleloader season on September 14th and continues through the 31st of December. We'd have a 3-day pre-rut whitetail antlerless season again on that Columbus Day weekend of the 10th and the 12th, 10th through the 12th of October. A regular firearm would start as it does traditionally on the Wednesday after Thanksgiving on December 2nd and runs through December 13th. And then the first extended whitetail antlerless season would be January 1st through January 10th. The second mid-length would be January 1st through January 17th. And the third extended would be the 1st through the January 24th. And then in the urban deer unit, we'd be looking at an extended archery season from the 25th through the 31st of January in 2021.
A year ago, we had somebody from the KLA complaining that we were not giving him enough days in one particular unit. This will solve that issue.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions for Levi on this?
Just out of curiosity, how does your hunter participation compare in that October antlerless season to the late season antlerless only?
It's been a while since I've looked at the numbers, but we see that there's some participation in October, and it is actually for the percentage of residents versus non-residents, it's one of the highest percentages of resident hunters participating in it. So it's definitely our residents that utilize that the most.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm Stacy again, but on the mule deer, either sex tags, that just Unit 1, is that what you're looking at?
Just Unit 1.
See, and we used to have it down here in Unit 2, but in 17, and they said, oh, you're the core area, you can take as many as you want, but then all of a sudden you get, we're not quite the core area as what we were in the past, and so
Yep.
now we got one core area. Is that one person complaining about deer, or do you have on mule?
It's a few comments and some.
Can I cancel him out? But no, well, I just wondering. You get one person complaining about it, and then you got to seem like you jump on some of that stuff.
So, no, it's also looking at our deer damage complaints and what we see from year to year at that.
Yeah.
So,
well, on the deer damage, sometimes I know people complain because you give them doe permits, and they said, why can't I have buck permits too? And then they just shoot bucks, and they're not taking does. So, but all right, that's what I was curious about. Thank you.
How many extra permits are you talking about in one?
that would be dependent on our population surveys that we're currently doing.
Like 5? 10?
It'd be a few more than that. It probably wouldn't be to the point of what had been previously issued before we quit, which was almost 100 up there, I believe.
Well, I'll still speak to my displeasure youth season September 5th. I still think it needs to be moved later into the fall to gather some more success for the youth. A lot of crops setting out there in September, my comment.
And mosquitoes. It's hot.
There's no season on mosquitoes.
No, there is no season on mosquitoes. Any other question?
That wraps up what I've got, so.
Thank you.
Yep, welcome. Thank you.
Public lands regulation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. At last month's meeting, I reported that we were going to undertake a pretty extensive review of our KAR 115.8 series public lands regulations. We were able to conduct that internal review. As part of that review, I reached out to Kansas chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers to ask for an independent external review. They complied with my request and did that. Subsequent to that, we were able to meet with them and discuss our findings, and based on that meeting, we really do not have any specific proposed changes or amendments to the regulation at this time. However, if you look at your briefing item, all those topics that I have listed there, trail cameras, non-toxic ammo, those are pretty dynamic topics that are continually evolving, not only in Kansas, but on a national scale. So it's something that we're going to continue to monitor and conduct further research on. Prime example would be the non-toxic ammo. The last time we made some proposed changes to that regulation, it garnished some controversy from NRA, National Shooting Sports Foundation, as well as ammunition manufacturers. So we want to do our due diligence and make sure that we're keeping up with the trends and what's going on in the industry, to name a few, before we make any specific proposed changes. So with that, we do not have any specific changes at this time, so I'd stand for any comments or questions.
Any questions for Stuart?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. I'll start out presenting on KAR 115-25-7 antelope open season bag limit and permits. This year's pronghorn harvest season ended at the end of October, and we're still trying to collect harvest reports in order to complete the final harvest analysis at this time. I did hear from several archery hunters this year who indicated the population was down in Unit 2. However, preliminary success rates of all three equipment types are at or above what they normally are, and so we'll have to wait until we get the rest of the harvest reports in to assess that issue. We will also conduct aerial surveys in January in a couple of the units, and so the January aerial surveys, as well as the completion of the harvest report, are the two things that we'll use to come back with permit allocation recommendations at a later date. At this time, we're not currently recommending any change to the season structure, bag limit, or permits for pronghorn. Just a quick overview of the existing regulations. The archery permits are unlimited and available over the counter for both residents and non-residents, and archery hunting is good in all three units. And there is a figure in the briefing book showing the three units. Firearm and muzzleloader permits are good in one of the three units, which units 2, 17, and 18 are open to hunting. And with the firearm and muzzleloader permits, half of these are allocated to landowners and tenants, and the other half are allocated to general residents. and I think I stated they're good in only one of the 3 units. The proposed hunting season dates are provided in the briefing book. I won't read over those, but like I said, those are standard. And then I guess the last thing I would say about this is our population survey reports and harvest reports are posted on the internet and always available to anybody who wants to look them up to see the type of data we collect and use to make decisions. So with that, I'll turn this back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Matt on antelope?
Stacy, are antelopes down in Unit 2?
Yeah. Stacy again. But yeah, we operate around 23,000 acres, or our harvest off of 23,000 acres of ranch land up there I hunt. And those numbers, we used to have approximately 50 to 70 antelope on that 23,000 acres. It's all grass. And right this year, I think the most I counted was like 41 head. So they seem to be down in that area, just in Unit 2. Yeah.
Okay.
So in 17, yeah, you still have a few floating around there. So, but thanks.
Yep, we survey the same areas every year. Our techniques in Unit 2 have changed somewhat in recent years, but the other units we survey the same areas every year, twice a year, and so that's part of our basis there. And then we're also always looking at success rates by hunters as well. So, sure.
What is the age of your antelope, though? I mean, there is success rates, but
sure.
I see a lot of young deer and a lot of young animal.
Yeah,
because people, I've hunted 7 years or applied for 7 or 6 years, and I'm going to shoot anything.
Right.
Or they
Or
travel from eastern Kansas and hunt deer the same way. I'm going to just shoot it. I want to shoot a mule deer buck. I don't care what it is, I'm going to shoot it. So it goes both ways.
I started collecting, we've been collecting teeth for a long time since I started, but we try to use teeth as a representative of an age class, and just as good as that, or at least I'm weighing the possibility, is horn length, because that's really what hunters are after, is have the horn length changed or declined over time. And I started asking hunters to take 2 measurements, and Stacy, as a hunter, you get those harvest reports, you probably noticed. In fact, I used the horn picture of one of Chasten, Stacy's son, in my harvest survey for years, and still do, that I used to ask for the horn measurement on. But I've been collecting that data since 2009, and the horn length and horn circumference haven't changed hardly at all. And I can show you the map here, or the figure in my harvest report here, but they've been extremely steady and stable, along with harvest success rates and along with our surveys. So sometimes I look at those, I hear from hunters who say how much they've declined in certain areas, and it doesn't really match up with some of the data we have. So I don't doubt that they've declined in some areas, and especially Unit 2 now more recently. But I have a hard time figuring out at the larger scale how significant changes have occurred to the population, and then the data that we collect hasn't shown any change at all. So, but yeah, I'll give you this harvest report when I sit back down.
Any other questions for Matt?
I'm Greg again, so I've been up before. Same way with Stacy, we hunted the northern part of Unit 17 this year. Saw a significant difference in numbers from what we did last year. And the other thing is they moved a long way. So a lot of the herds had really bumped 5 miles or 10 miles from where they had been before too. So, but the herds were smaller than what we were seeing the last 2 years. So that was just the northern part of 17. And then I support Stacy on the deal on the mule deer. The deer they shouldn't be issued more. If somebody complained, so I'm behind Stacy to counteract the ones complaining about the numbers.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Let's go to elk.
Okay. KR 11525 8, this is elk open season, bag limit, and permits. The current season is ongoing, and so far, just a little bit of a harvest update. We know that 10 of the 30 permits valid on Fort Riley have harvested elk. They've been successful, and a couple of additional elk have been taken around Fort Riley, but I have not received harvest reports from hunters outside the fort, or away from the fort, I should say, in other parts of the state yet this year. And that doesn't mean they're not out there. Sometimes they need a reminder partway through or at the end of the season to send their harvest report in, but I haven't heard of any at this time. Elk, this is the second time I presented this regulation, same as pronghorn. We don't anticipate any changes to season structure, bag limits, or permit types. But again, I'll quickly hit the season highlights in case you're somewhat unfamiliar with them. The unit boundaries are defined in KR 115.46B, and units 2 and 3 are open to hunting. And again, there's a figure in the briefing book. You can see the little unit 2 is the area that includes Fort Riley as well as a buffer unit around it. And then unit 1, the area that's closed, encompasses Cimarron National Grasslands down in southwest Kansas. On Fort Riley, the season is broken into 1-month segments, and the month of September is an archery and muzzleloader season, and all Fort Riley permit holders can hunt during that time. October, November, and December are 1-month segments in which 1/3 of the antlerless only permits are valid during each segment, and any elk permits are valid during all 3 of those segments, and all of the the October, November, December seasons are any legal equipment can be used. Obviously, on the fort at various times, they may have equipment restriction in certain units that maybe only allow archery or maybe no rifles, stuff like that. And so that's a thing that's done for flexibility, for hunters to have the flexibility to be able to successfully hunt Fort Riley. On private lands, the elk seasons mostly correspond with deer season equipment restrictions, with the main difference being that the elk season begins August 1, with a month-long firearm season intended to allow private landowners to address damage issues. And then there's also an extended elk season that runs January 1 through March 15, extending well beyond any of the open deer seasons. So otherwise, for the most part, the elk seasons are similar to deer seasons off of Fort Riley. Elk permits are available only to Kansas residents, and permit applications are separated into military and non-military applicants. And I won't go into the details of how that's done unless you have specific questions about it, but it's sort of weighted to allow military applicants a little bit of an advantage to hunt on Fort Riley, so they don't have to compete 1-to-1 against the 1,000 general resident applicants who apply for those permits. Unit 2 allocations will be determined at a later date as we hear more about how this hunting season is gone, and oftentimes the fort tries to run aerial surveys in January or sometime in later winter to get a handle on what the elk population is out there. But we usually don't change those permit allocations by more than a couple of permits a year, so I would not expect any big changes on Unit 2 allocations. And then, let's see, in Unit 2, an unlimited number of hunt-owned land, antlerless only and either sex permits are authorized. And then in Unit 3, those permits are authorized as well as general resident permits, unlimited general resident permits in Unit 3. So that's all I have on elk, and I would turn this back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, does anybody have any questions on this subject for Matt? Looks like you did a great job then, no questions.
All right.
All right,
Thank you.
I think that concludes what I have on the agenda for the afternoon session. I want to thank all the presenters, and I want to thank the commission for its thoughtfulness and consideration and discussion this afternoon. So I'm going to, I think I'm going to recess, not adjourn, recess the meeting, and we'll meet back here at 6:30 for a fair amount of items in public hearing. So, thank you all.